Okay, Gitane, welcome. Good to see you again. I feel like you're going to get tired of seeing my face these days. We've been chatting so much lately on US Canada. How are you?
I'm good, and I'm always happy to talk to you.
Well, I'm really glad that we both had time to actually return to this discussion that we were having last week at the Young Women in Energy conference. There were so many amazing questions that came from the audience, and that conference was so good and so many amazing panels. We just didn't have enough time to get to all of them. So I'm really looking forward to kind of unpacking things. Plus, like, as we mentioned last week, there are some new things happening today. I'm calling it T-Day, which I don't mean to be disrespectful, but it's like, it seems like we are dealing with all of the threats materializing today and into the next few weeks. So maybe just to start off, do you want to just give like another overview of where we're currently at with tariffs in Canada so we can set the stage for the questions that were asked?
Yeah, every day is a new adventure in this scenario, sometimes multiple adventures in one day.
Yes.
So where we are today is that President Trump has made good on his threat, and the tariffs have taken effect as of midnight or 12:01 this morning. So we have a 25% tariff on all Canadian goods except for a 10% tariff on energy. The Prime Minister has announced that Canada will in fact retaliate. So we're starting with $30 billion worth of tariffs in retaliation, escalating to $125 billion in 21 days if we don't get them lifted in the interim. And I expect that there's some pretty intense negotiations continuing behind the scenes today. Even though the tariffs have taken effect, I don't think that Canada or Mexico is taking that sitting down. And so, well, maybe they are sitting down to negotiate, but they will continue to try and find a path forward where we can get these tariffs lifted as quickly as possible, because while American consumers are the ones who pay the tariffs that the US has set, there will absolutely be impacts on the Canadian economy. And so we need to act quickly and decisively to try to get these tariffs lifted.
So looking into your crystal ball, because we all of us have a crystal ball of our own, maybe they don't all say the same things. Do you think this is something that Canada is going to be dealing with over the next 4 years, or do you think it'll be shorter term, or is it too soon to say?
It's a great question. I mean, we saw a very strong response from the stock market yesterday when the president announced that the tariffs would in fact take effect. And that is an indicator that President Trump watches. So we have to continue to watch the reaction of the stock market and of investors. President Trump, I think, is pretty invested in the idea of tariffs as a mean to reset the table. He believes that trade agreements are unfair, but you could do that through negotiations. He believes that tariffs are a way to onshore production to the United States and rebuild their manufacturing base and the good jobs that come with that. And, you know, that is a potential that could happen over time, but it won't happen overnight. And in the meantime, American consumers are dealing with affordability issues. The really sticky one is the fact that tariffs are a way to raise revenue. And President Trump wants to make his tax cuts from his first administration permanent. And the bill for that is $4.3 trillion. So that's a pretty big hole in their budget, and they need to figure out a way to fix that. So I think that revenue generation piece is central to their approach. So I really don't know what's going to happen. I don't foresee a scenario where the US economy does well with these tariffs, certainly not on everything and at their current level. And just to point out as well that with these tariffs now on Canada and Mexico, we're actually the two most disadvantaged trading partners of the United States. The average tariff on other goods entering the US is 2.5 to 3%. So it's a really strange approach to the world's largest trading partnership. I just can't foresee a scenario where it lasts, but there will definitely be pain in the interim. And it's anyone's best guess in terms of how soon the tariffs can in fact be lifted.
That's so fascinating. So there were a few questions on tariffs that had to do with we can sort of agree that at face value, this is a negative economic thing for Canada in the short term, at least. But there were some questions, which I'm going to get to in a second, that basically were asking, okay, if we could see a silver lining in these tariffs in terms of what it's going to force Canada to have to do or make decisions or sort of face hard truths that maybe we haven't had to face lately. So I want to get to that. But before I do, I just, on the last sort of level setting aspect of this, basically the hour before we were speaking, this whole Zelensky, Vance, Trump Oval Office exchange was also happening. And then we saw some announcements this week as well on that. And I was posting yesterday too, just about, you mentioned the economy and raising revenues. It is very interesting how these conversations are not just economic conversations anymore and how they're interconnected. The Wall Street Journal article that I posted yesterday made note of the fact that the U.S. now spends more on debt servicing than it does on defense, which the author, Neil Ferguson, who I'm sure many political junkies really enjoy, talks about how that is actually the beginning of the end of great power status. So I wanted to just open it up if you had anything to say in response to that exchange that happened and how these are connected to tariffs.
Well, part of what the president is trying to do is reset the world order, which I think he already has done in part, and we'll have to watch to see what other changes emerge. But yes, absolutely, Americans are concerned about the size of their debt, who owns that debt, and what it means for their own security and stability. So, while they have traditionally been the global police officer, that comes at great cost. And so they are really pushing the rest of the world to step up. And while I in no way condone President Trump's methods, part of what he's pushing for is a renegotiation of traditional allegiances and who pays for what. So, him pulling out the U.S. support for Ukraine and then forcing the EU to step up and play a larger role, that saves Americans money. It potentially saves them lives in terms of where they're sending soldiers to fight and defend principles of democracy and freedom. So that is absolutely part of his calculus, and that he feels that the U.S. has played an outsized role or paid too much to defend the rest of the world and received too little in return. So it really is this shift from traditional multilateralism to more of a mercantilist approach, right? Almost going back to a colonial viewpoint where you're all about commodities and logistics and less about principles and worldviews.
Totally. And that's a great segue into one of the questions that we have in terms of maybe we're not having a, defense or military conversation as Canadians with the US right now, but what are some of these tariff moves and this changing world order? What are some of the things that we could do as Canadians in response to this that would leave us better off? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I'm a huge proponent of getting rid of barriers to internal trade. So these are largely differences in standards and regulations or actual domestic protectionist measures where different provinces and territories are looking to grow a sector of their economy or protect it from a larger sector in a neighboring province. And now is absolutely the moment. This is something we can do domestically all by ourselves. Not saying it won't be hard. It will be hard. There's winners and losers in every trade agreement. And so we have to be mindful of the fact that these barriers exist as a way to protect certain things or certain industries. But this is the moment, right? If we can get rid of these barriers, we can grow our own economy from anywhere to 3 to 9%, depending on the study. Trevor Toom's study that came out earlier said it was 7.9%, and that's about $200 billion. So it would not completely insulate us from a 25% tariff if that lasts long term, but it certainly would go a long way to boosting our economy. And then if we can trade and make more together, I think there's the opportunity to build on that and grow our economy further. So that's definitely something we should be doing right now.
Well, and I think to build on what you're saying there, I think it also sends, from the economic perspective, there's obvious benefits on internal trade barriers, but it also sends a message, I think, to the United States and others of hey, we're not throwing our hands up anymore. We understand it's a new world order, as you say, and we're going to respond accordingly with foreign policy, but also with domestic policy. So I think that's a really good point. Trevor Toom's and you and others have been on this for over a decade. So, I mean, sometimes these things don't come in the prettiest boxes, but the way I've been describing it to people is I'm by no means sort of condoning or happy about what's happening. Absolutely not. But I think it was Oprah that was always saying, it comes as a whisper and then it comes as a nudge and then it comes and then you're up against a wall, really. And so I think that's part of what's happening here. So that was a really good question. Anything you'd want to add to that on interprovincial trade or collaboration as it relates directly to the energy sector?
Well, the saying, never waste a good crisis, right? I think that the limitation on the energy side is infrastructure, right? I do get the question, if Canada has such an abundance of resources, why are we not energy self-sufficient? And a lot of that has to do with infrastructure or lack thereof. So if you look at a map of pipelines and power lines in Canada, of course, most of those go north-south as opposed to east-west. And there's a bunch of reasons for that: geology, geography, and a regulatory system. So I think Canada is also having a conversation now. You're seeing support increased drastically for more domestic energy infrastructure. And the question we have is, how quickly can you get that built? How quickly can you get to yes, create investment certainty for proponents to actually want to get the project built? And how can we move forward in partnership with our Indigenous partners, making sure reconciliation is at the center of any project going forward? So I think that's the other part of this conversation is what can we do? Can we build infrastructure quickly, to where and how?
This leads into another great question that we had. So somebody asked, is there an opportunity to examine our market regions to decrease our 75% dependence on the USA? So essentially exploring new export regions. So what are your thoughts on that? Obviously, the first question is on domestic policy as well, but maybe answer that in two parts of there's the domestic side, but what do we have to do from a foreign policy and diplomatic perspective to open those markets up?
Well, Canada already has 15 free trade agreements covering 51 countries, but our trade with our NAFTA, our North American partners, is 5 times bigger than our trade with the other 14 agreements combined. So we do just have to acknowledge, be pragmatic, and acknowledge where we're starting from. So it is a big lift. It's not to say it's not possible, but it is a big lift. And shifting that focus, shifting where we sell our goods and services will require some work, some education, and some infrastructure. So it's easy for Canadians to export to the United States, common language, similar business culture, and you can sort of test things out in a market that's bigger than your Canadian market, but not super daunting. Selling to China, to India, to Germany, to Japan is a bit trickier given language barriers and distance, right? So we need to educate entrepreneurs about the opportunities, how those trade agreements work. There will need to be support from government, I think, in that regard, in terms of other, and organizing trading delegations or providing training to people to better understand that. Then we'll need the infrastructure in place, right? A lot of our infrastructure goes north-south, not just energy infrastructure. So making sure we have ports, rails, and all the pieces there to get that stuff to those markets in a timely way, because we have to be a reliable trading partner. That will be really key. So I definitely think it's something we can do, and it's something we should continue to work towards, but we also need to acknowledge it's not an overnight solution, and those domestic options are much more quickly achieved if we can get the political will together to bring those barriers down. Then it really doesn't take any education to sell from Alberta to Saskatchewan or Alberta to Ontario, whereas it'll be a bit of a bigger lift to sell something, like I say, to a country that's much further away and has a very different business culture.
I love that. I think you also have such great advice too, because of your roles in diplomatic roles, where you're really like you work as part of a government and between governments, but you also deal a lot with stakeholders and businesses, or dealt with a lot of stakeholders and businesses. What did you find? Because it sounds to me like there's, a domestic policy piece, a foreign policy piece, but then a business and private sector stakeholder piece. So what did you find worked the best in opening up those new markets from a stakeholder perspective? Like if I'm a business that operates in Canada and exports a lot to the United States, and I'm really worried about how these tariffs are going to impact me, I'm going to urge my government to do all of those things. But what am I going to do as an individual or business as well to help bring that along?
Well, I think it does start with paying attention and educating yourself and speaking up, so that engagement with your elected officials is absolutely key. And then you have to play your own role in the system, right? This is not an instance or a situation where government can or should fix it all. This is very much a team approach. So you need to do your own research about what your market opportunities may be. Certainly getting that assistance from the Trade Commissioner Service or others in the Government of Canada or the provincial government that have that expertise.
Maybe they want to hire you too.
That's right. Hire me, hire you.
Yep.
Lots of opportunities there. There's smart people out there that can help you, but start to educate yourself and make a business plan, and then figure out, if you do need additional supports, be vocal in asking for those. And then I think you have to engage when the government does put together a trade delegation. Put your hand up and give it a try, right? I'm not saying it's not daunting. I'm not saying it doesn't cost money, but you're going to have to try these things and, really try to make those connections yourself and learn from others that went before you, right? There's lots of great resources out there.
Yeah. And I think because going back to your point earlier, we are in the midst of a changing world order. So when change happens, it is the people who are at the table that are going to be able to contribute to those decisions. And of course, no one business is going to have, outsized impact on that. But again, it's this sort of theme that I'm seeing in business and life too. It's like these small, consistent efforts over time, and working together and being collaborative does, I think, go a lot further than people than people realize. So maybe just having expectations that are like, it's not going to change overnight, but it's not going to change if you don't start, kind of thing, and you don't work slowly towards some of those goals.
Yeah, I have friends that work in sales and they'll tell me it takes, 5 or 6 conversations oftentimes to land a deal. And this will be a similar approach. You're going to have to keep at it for sure.
Yes, it's such a good point. Building a little bit more on the sort of Canadian perspective, there was a question that came in that said, what are your thoughts on Saskatchewan Premier's statement on pre-approved pipelines and the need for more cross-border pipes for egress in Canada? What are your thoughts about that?
I think it's a great idea, right? If you could get a pre-approved energy corridor, we just also have to be mindful of our constitution, right? Different orders of government. That's right. I mean, it's really important, and it is written the way it's written. It gives the provinces authority over natural resources, and it gives the federal government authority over how those resources move across borders. There's joint jurisdiction on environmental issues. So it does get tricky, but if you could negotiate something, and again, I believe strongly that reconciliation has to be central to that process. So it's including Indigenous nations from the outset in those conversations, and really focusing on things like equity partnerships, Indigenous loan guarantees, whatever is required to help them actually be a full partner, then that is possible. Then you also have to get the community's acceptance, the people that live around there, because, any infrastructure can be tricky to build. Some people don't like windmills. Some people don't want, some type of logistics facility close to them because the additional truck traffic. So having those conversations and getting the community's engagement, helping them to see the benefit. I think, there is that rising support right now. So if we can capitalize on that to develop a corridor, and yes, it would be great to have greater infrastructure. I think the other thing we're going to need, though, is that business or proponents are going to look for some type of guarantee from government, whether that is loan backstops or equity or something to demonstrate that the government is as committed to getting these things built. Because the reality is that over time, we have seen the increased role of elected officials in our regulatory processes, giving them greater decision-making opportunities. And with that comes opportunities for delay. So I think that in order to actually get to yes, we're going to need to see that commitment, that financial commitment from government in some form, so that industry knows that government also wants to see it built and see it built in a timely way.
Yeah. And I mean, I know it's kind of in vogue to hate on the current federal government in Canada for any number of reasons, not the least of which is because they've been there for 10 years. And that is just the cycle of how politics go. But I do want to mention, I think the federal government, it was last budget, I think, where they introduced a federal loan guarantee program for Indigenous communities, much like what Alberta has had for a few years. They have gone down that road of talking about contracts for difference. So that's more related to the sort of economics of the carbon price and the sort of risk that is inherent for proponents there if that goes away on the consumer side, which if there is a change in government federally in Canada, we can 99% guarantee is going to happen, though hopefully not for businesses, but I don't think that's really the direction of industrial pricing that they're going. But I think there are some moves in that direction that are positive. But in terms of I think it's hard. This sort of leads into another question here, talking about whether the future Liberal leader and Conservative leader, what do they need to do to campaign to work with Trump? We talked a bit about this last week. I think that it's kind of short-sighted to just say, Conservative, good, Liberal, bad when it comes to this. And you had some really great thoughts on that. So I'd love for you to just sort of expand on what you were talking about on Friday and sort of address that. What are these? We have an election coming up in God knows when. Could be next month, a couple months, could be October when it's scheduled. We don't know. But what do they have to think about?
Well, there's no easy path here. There's no one leader who's going to have it easier than the other. I think they'll just have a different set of challenges. And I think that focus on tariffs will remain. So we have to figure out as a nation how we want to deal with that. I think you absolutely need someone who is a grown-up, who is a true leader, is willing to put the best interests of the country first, which is hard in politics. And it'll be hard, I think, for the next little bit because of the uncertainty and people are campaigning for votes. And it's not always possible to campaign for votes and actually do the right hard thing at the same time. But we do need someone who's going to be able to make decisions and to make difficult decisions. We also need someone that can build a coalition. This is a very much a Team Canada moment. So someone who is able to reach across party lines and work with premiers from across the country, mayors, business leaders, Indigenous leaders. They really need to be able to form that coalition and to empower people to play to their strengths. There is no way that any one person or even the federal cabinet can do all the things right now. So allowing or enabling, building the team, understanding people's strengths, and then asking them to play to those strengths. So if you are the Premier of Alberta and you know people that are very active in the Make America Great Again movement, then the Premier should be empowered to go have those conversations and to try to advance Canada's interest in that regard. So I think that'll be really crucial. And I think, it is going to be someone who has the strength to ride out the tough times, right? It is going to get tougher before it gets easier. So someone who actually can remain calm and continue to steer the ship in the right direction, even if it gets bumpy, and just acknowledge that, sometimes it gets worse before it gets better, but keep that long-term strategic focus on what are Canada's core interests, where can we not give, and really focus on those with a view to, you can build up other things over time, but there'll be a few core things that we cannot give up, and to really remain focused on those.
I really like what you're saying about that. And it reminds me of, I think, the struggle that we have in politics and public policy today of so this is me getting into my opinion a little bit more now, but we almost need a decoupling of moral judgment from policy decisions. Not that morality shouldn't play a role in policy decisions. Of course it should. But I think that we have gotten, in the United States for sure, but especially in Canada too, we've gotten to a point of we judge policies based on who talks about them. Mm-hmm. Oh, this party good, this party bad. Therefore, anything each of these parties say is good or bad. And we sometimes, when it comes to the Trump side of things, I know a lot of people in my network have different views on Trump, but those are kind of irrelevant when it comes to actually making a deal and advancing interests. I know we only have a few minutes left, but perhaps you could touch on that before we talk about how we continue to stay informed. How do business leaders and individuals decouple whatever discomfort they may feel of making a deal or working with somebody that they don't like that much or agree with?
Yeah, it's one thing if you don't like them. It's another thing if you have a really strong moral opposition. So I would just say that if if there's an issue where you really don't see the world in the same way, then I think you have to look for different partners. But, the world is not black and white, and two things can be true at the same time. I can be a passionate supporter of Canada's oil and gas industry and also know that climate change is real. I want my children to inherit an inhabitable planet. It's not an either or, and many things are complex. And so I think you need to start from a place of curiosity and acknowledge that if you want to be successful in any negotiation, you first need to understand the other side. So, it is that old adage, first seek to understand. And then, you do have to suspend judgment just because someone, I don't know, they're a huge Flames fan, heaven forbid, and you love the Oilers, or the other way around. It doesn't make them a bad person. Yeah. So one element of their belief system is not who a person is. And so, figuring out what you have in common. My degree is Middle East Peace Studies, actually. And why I pursued that was I was so interested in why, people that live so close together and have so much common history are so, are constantly at odds. And so how can you focus on what you have in common and try to get to yes, and acknowledge the things you cannot change, right? You're not going to change people's minds on certain things. If they're a Flames fan, you're not going to convert them and make them an Oilers fan. And so just accept that and move on. Don't waste your energy on those things that you can't change the outcome of, and really focus where you can. I think that'll be critical.
Yeah. And I think that you hit the nail on the head. I even in my own work try to think of it as just those dolls that you can why you keep on asking why until you get to the core of the issue, because I'm scared of this, because I am worried about this. And usually if you can ask that enough times, you can get to a place where even if you don't agree with somebody, you can have compassion for where they're coming from most of the time, not all the time, but okay. The last questions that we had several questions that had to do with like staying informed and getting accurate news. I had some ideas about this at the panel. You had some ideas, literally like 4 questions. How can we keep our company's executive teams informed about this? What's the best way to get accurate information? Where do I get accurate news? What are your thoughts on that? I have some thoughts too, I'll share after.
Yeah, that's great. So I do board briefings. If anyone wants to hire me to come in and talk to the board, have an in-camera session and answer all the questions, because it is complicated and nuanced and constantly changing. I'm a big fan of podcasts. I do like to listen to those. During the week, I listen to shorter ones, and I do traditionally go to some American sources just to, for me, I feel it's more accurate if I'm listening to Americans talk about what's going on than a Canadian's interpretation of what's happening, though sometimes that can be helpful. So I like the shorter podcasts, like New York Times, The Daily has one, NPR has some, Fox News has some, and I do think it's important to listen to a variety of media outlets. I also like the weekend analysis. I find that, the pace of change is such that, trying to keep on top of the news during the week for me is personally exhausting. So I usually wait till the evening to catch up, and then I really wait for the weekend for that evening analysis. Or that weekend analysis where you can actually digest kind of what happened all week long and how do these pieces fit together, as opposed to constantly just reacting, really taking some time to make sense of things.
Yes. And I think, so I mentioned this on the panel too, and I'll reiterate it. I think that I see this all the time in my work. Something happens, like some political news happens, an update happens, and we almost have, because of our relationship with social media and instant gratification and 24-hour news cycle, we have, or I know I do at least, this emotional response to needing to do something about every single thing. Like you see a notification and you need to do something about it. I think for people who are advising CEOs and responsible for managing this information flow within their business, I think it's really important to do 2 things. First of all, I think it's important to go to primary sources for your news and have a predetermined sort of like metric of what is happening. What are the things that could happen in the news that would impact your business, and how, and what would the actual effect be based on whatever's happening? You have to have a really clear idea of that, which means you have to have a very clear sense of why you exist as an organization, which I think just goes back to good strategic planning and governance. So using those primary source materials, but also, like, one thing I didn't say last week was encouraging and embracing a culture shift around rapid response on some of these things. Like, you've worked with a lot of large companies, Gitane. It is very rare where like something happens at 9:30 and you need to know exactly what you're going to do about it by 10:30. Like, I think that there is, while things are moving quickly and companies in many cases do need to move quickly, I think, what did you say? You said take a breath or just like keep calm in this. Like, that is so underrated, especially today. Like, figure out if it matters actually to your business, get it from a primary source, determine if it matters. And then to your point as well, I love to listen to like the polar opposite ends of the spectrum on issues. Like, I will listen to Rachel Maddow and Ben Shapiro on what happened in the Oval Office on Friday, and I will get my own perspective somewhere in between. So that's my advice, at least.
Yeah. And also, like, if something happens at 9:30 that has such a huge impact on your business and you're blindsided, it's not a great thing to be, right? So if it's something like tariffs, I mean, this conversation has been ongoing for months now. So you would hope that there's some type of strategy. Like, occasionally something really truly does come out of the blue and you have to figure out how to respond. I don't think the world was ready for COVID. So that's an instance where it's like, okay, but again, you have to take a deep breath and figure it out, and, take the time to really understand and remain focused on those key priorities, those key bottom lines, and how you're going to protect them.
Completely agree. Well, any last thoughts you want to leave the sort of listeners with before we say goodbye and deal with the rest of today, whatever that will bring?
Well, the one other question we did get at the conference was, a bit of a controversial one for some
Oh,
people,
yeah.
and that is, would Canada's economy be better off objectively if we were the 51st state?
Yes, I can't
And I
believe I
have
forgot to
strong
ask that.
views. Yeah, I've got strong views on this one, but I realized I didn't fully explain why. So, if my response to that, would Canada's economy be better off if we were the 51st state? My answer to that is an emphatic no, not just because I'm a patriotic Canadian, but because we wouldn't, in fact, be a state, we would be a territory. And the reason for that is if you look at the outcome of US elections over the last 20 plus years, the margin of votes that has separated who has won the White House, the House, the Senate has been quite small. And so there's no way that Americans are going to let a bunch of Canadians determine the outcome of their elections. There's enough of us that we could sway that margin one way or another. And so they're not going to let us do that. It means instead we would be a territory like Guam or Puerto Rico with very limited rights. So you get a local governor, but you get zero say in who sits in the White House, zero say in federal policy. So imagine a situation whereby, the American federal government is deciding how Canada's oil, gas, critical minerals, water get used, and we can do nothing about it. So I believe our democratic rights are worth much more than cheaper taxes and a home in Florida. So that's something I would say, no, we are not better off. We would not be better off in no way, shape, or form.
Okay, do I have time for one more sort of corollary off of that question?
Sure.
Okay. What about a union like the EU has with common monetary policy, separate countries, and separate fiscal policy? I've been seeing people talk about that all the time.
Yeah, if you could go back to a relationship of respect, then I think that's a conversation you could have. But you can't enter into those conversations if one partner is seen or feels to be so far superior to one or others, right? And then the question is it just Canada and the US? Does it also involve Mexico? That gets tricky from an immigration perspective. But we do have to remember Mexico is the US's largest trading partner right now. And so impacts on Mexico will impact the United States, which will impact Canada. So we need to think that through about what type of approach we would want to take. But yeah, you could see. But then again, your comment before about the size of the US debt and the amount they spend servicing it, we would have to be strategic about those conversations because it does impact the price of the dollar at the end of the day. So and there are some benefits to Canada, some believe, to having a lower value dollar. We would like to have a dollar that's not as volatile as it is, but some believe there is a benefit to a lower value dollar in terms of currency exchange and things. So definitely a conversation you could have, but only if we were in a place of respect.
Well, that's a good note to leave it on. Respect, kindness, being open to solutions. I think it was really good to have this discussion and the follow-up. I think, we're so appreciated all of the questions. It was such a great crowd at YWE last week, like a really engaged group of young professionals that are, passionate about learning about this stuff. So if people want to continue to follow you, engage with you, work with you, maybe let people know where they can do that if they want to.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm on LinkedIn. I'm the only Gitane de Silva there. Shocker. I'm also on Instagram, and then you can reach me through my website, which is gdstrategic.com.
Amazing. Awesome. Well, thanks so much, Gitane, for making yourself available. Bless you on what I imagine is going to be a very busy day and week for you. And we'll continue this conversation, I'm sure, hopefully with more positive news next time. But either way, we'll keep it going on.
Thanks so much, Melissa.
Thanks, Gitane.